I'm Yisrael Naaman, co-founder of the Naaman Academy. We all welcome you to our complimentary class on anti-Semitism. My background: for some 40 years, I've taught at different venues, including the University of Haifa, the Technion, different private institutions, and have given lectures abroad and tours in Israel, emphasizing the academic side, of course, but we have plenty of fun. This class on anti-Semitism is only sort of the intro to what we'll be having a full course during 2025. So with no further ado, let's get on with our class today. Okay, oldest and most obsessive hatred, and unfortunately this has been going for some 2,300 years. If we take in, we'll be seeing in the first slide discussing Pharaoh, so it could be certainly even more. In any case, anti-Semitism begins in the ancient world, mentioned in Tanakh, or the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, and it's here that, of course, we know about the Exodus from Egypt, and there's the whole question of whether that was really anti-Semitism or not, or just that the Egyptians felt very threatened by Semites. I'm going to leave that discussion aside. We certainly can trace it back to destruction of Jewish babies thrown into the Nile. But like I said, what I want to get to, we'll start with, which has had a very big impact on us throughout over 2,000 years. I say on us, on the Jews, but on the world overall, is the anti-Semitism of the Greco-Roman world. And here we have the slide, just a couple of words, that there was really no understanding of monotheism, the idea of an invisible God, Shabbat, all the mitzvot, right, the deeds that we are to do, things that not to do. And it seemed quite ridiculous to the ancients, when we take Greece and Rome. And it was sort of laughable that this Judean group is doing something like worshiping an invisible God, while everybody else has statues of their gods. They can tell you about their personalities, on and on. What do we say? God, right? Or all the different names we have in Hebrew, right? The tetragrammaton that we have, meaning was, is, always will be, right? And the Judeans with the values of these empires, and they also find it sort of ridiculous that, we'll take the Greeks for instance, that the Jews or the Judeans see themselves as chosen, right? And the question is, chosen for what? We know there's a moral, ethical issue as well, understandings of bring messianic end time and good for everyone, but saying if you're so chosen, so why do you keep losing all your wars? Why are you not an empire? And it was seen as hubris, when that was not the intent at all. What is understood by them is that this is a very strange people. There are certain things they can eat. There are certain things they can't eat. There's one God, invisible, incorporeal. Where is this God in the temple? Do you go to look for him? There are no statues. There's no anything. Okay. But it was seen as a power, and therefore you had the rebellion, right? When there's religious oppression, rebellion against the Greeks in the Hanukkah story, and that takes place in the 2nd century BCE, before the Common Era, and later on the Jewish revolt against Rome. The Romans inherit much of this understanding that this Judean group is very strange. It's true, and we need to be careful. Those who understood the Greek wisdoms, both from our side and, of course, the scholars on their side, as well as in Rome, there were those who were not as ardent. However, there's a definite intellectual group, and that's where I want to start, that was quite anti-Judean, anti-Semitic, we call it today, and in particular we speak of the ancient world. There are those like Apion, who would be a publicist who was viciously anti-Judean, anti-Jewish, and led to a lot of troubles, especially in Alexandria in the 1st century. That same 1st century, okay, and we have it here, right, the Jewish revolt against Rome fails, and the temple's destroyed, and that's said to be the proof of Jews falling from God's favor. Okay, So that first was cultural anti-Semitism. Did it very briefly, like everything else will be. And we have the Jews, theologically, right? We know that you have the development of Christianity and the Gospels. Right. Now, what happens in the Gospels and in the Christian scriptures is that there actually is a break here within Judaism. In other words, it's not an external event, it's not an external group, but rather Jesus of Nazareth, and some call him Yeshu, others say Yehoshua, not important. He is seen to beginning a new religion. He didn't know that he was doing that particularly. Okay, we can say that maybe, in the last day of his life, he understood certainly something was very different. But we're not going to get into that. What does happen is that his followers, who are Jewish, all right, they're Judeans, they take a very, very or call it rabbinical Jewish perspective. And when it's written down as polemics inside the framework of the Jews, right, we start getting serious condemnations. And of course, the Greco-Romans, that's what we'll call all of the sort of the Europeans, Greco-Romans, the Europeans that are here, they, in the writings up of the Gospels years later, right, claim that the death of Jesus, right, that the Jews in essence forced Pontius Pilate to agree to have Jesus executed, and that they say, may his blood be on us and on our children, not just on the hands of that generation, but now it goes for many, many generations. What is our children? We can say, generally in Judaism, was thought of as, could be 3 generations. Here, talking about forever, and that's where the great disaster really begins. Now, it does fall on the fertile ground of a negative attitude towards Judeans / Jews, right? As we go into diaspora, we call ourselves more Jews. It does fall on fertile ground of those who already saw these Judeans a very strange group. And here I quoted from Matthew, and then Mark and Luke, right? The Jews crying, crucify him, when Pontius Pilate offers whether Jesus should be executed or a criminal who's who is thinking to let go, and figures the Jews would rather have him finished. And no, Barabbas, his name was, right? He is seen as, they let him go, and we'll have, quote, will be seen as the Messiah later on, right? We'd rather have him executed. Now, when you get into some of the theologians afterwards, Augustine, St. Augustine, John Chrysostom, they see that Jews have the mark of Cain or destruction, right? Although Augustine would not be as harsh, he would say the Jews could redeem themselves, give more possibilities. Chrysostom was very, very anti-Jewish. He was one of the church fathers in the Byzantine Empire. He was so radical that he himself was eventually removed from his post. But still, people remember that. They don't remember what happened to him and how radical he was. That his direction became the one that many would adopt in harsh anti-Semitism. And when you speak of Augustine, so it was like, okay, the Jews should realize when Jesus has the second coming. If they don't then they're really in deep trouble. Okay, moving right along. The Byzantine Empire. So you have the codification of anti-Semitism, right? Meaning that you have it legalized. There is Christian suppression of the Jews. At the very outset, the Jews are, remember, it's the continuation of the Roman Empire, so it's the eastern part, and the Jews are seen as a separate group. The pagans are first persecuted because they don't believe in God at all, or one God. But it doesn't take too long before Jews themselves find that they're between the pagans and the Christians. Little by little lose their rights. It starts with under Constantine, okay, although he doesn't really do too much. Under Theodosius, Christianity is declared the religion of the empire, but it was always going in that direction. That's around the year 380. And then the one who really presses an anti-Semitism is Justinian, and that's in the 500s, and he rules for a long time, the mid-6th century, and he already has the power behind the throne for a good 10 years beforehand. So eventually, under Justinian, Jews can't even study Mishnah, right? They can't say Shema. Shema speaks of one God, and we know that the Trinity in Christianity is very important. And Jews eventually are banned from all public offices, including tax collection. Now, Jews are an outgroup, and often you put your outgroups as the tax collectors, because who likes your tax collector, right? People don't like the tax collector. But even that, they decided they can't be loyal, and you have a loyalty to empire and religion, and they're one. To be a loyal Byzantine is to be a loyal Christian. To be a loyal Christian is to be a loyal Byzantine. And therefore, the Jews become, in the legislation in the Christian world, the outgroup, permanent outgroup, right? We are seen as a people in exile. And we see ourselves that way also. So everybody agrees on that. Okay, Islam does similar, very similar. Once they capture parts of the Byzantine Empire, once exploding out of the Arabian Peninsula, they impose what would become the Dima Code. We should make clear here already that in battles for control in the city of Medina, where there were powerful Jewish tribes, they were defeated. Right, the Jewish tribes two were forced out. Another one was destroyed in what could be considered the first jihad, where you had between 600 and 900 Jewish men slaughtered and women and children taken prisoner or shatel and forced to convert to Islam. So Jews have to pay a special tax, a jizya tax. You also had, as regulated religion, Jews pay extra taxes in the Byzantine Empire. And like as in the Byzantine Empire, cannot testify against Muslims, lose their rights, but then the Byzantine Empire should say against Christians, they lose their rights. Same issue with Muslims in the Islamic conquests, and you can't testify. You live in segregated quarters. There is distinctive clothing one must wear, and you could see that in the maps here how Islam spread quite quickly throughout, right, the Middle East. And we have a map of Islamic dominant nations today on the right-hand side. Okay, now from here, from the legal frameworks, you have a popular anti-Semitism. It begins and intensifies in the 1100s. Let's say, put it out here clearly. Anti-Semitism does not begin with the average person. It is an intellectual or legalist framework movement. It starts more at the top. Think of, right, we didn't get into discussion about Pharaoh. We can do that. Think about the Greco-Roman leadership, Antiochus, right, in ancient Greece. Think about the Roman emperors, and then what happens in the Byzantine Empire. It's from the top down, okay, which will bring us towards the end. We'll see where it's in academia, right? And by the way, it's discussed by scholars and polemicists, people who are literate. So when we get to popular anti-Semitism, we're speaking of a movement that is, or thought to be, starting with the people, but not exactly. And it does start, right, these accusations. And here we have a picture of Simon of Trent, right? The blood libel of the 15th century, but begins way before that, the 1100s, in other words, 12th century, actually begins in Britain, an accusation that a Jewish worker kills a Christian child, and for his blood. Discussion there was in Britain, and it doesn't spread so fast. It takes several years, but who makes the accusation? It's a local cleric, a local priest. And the people say, but the Jews live here. They don't cause a lot of trouble. But he says it long enough and is insistent enough, and a few people catch on to it. Of course, the child's relatives. And it takes a bit of time to spread, a few years, but once it spreads, that's it. It explodes. But it didn't start from the very top, but it starts from someone who's literate. Okay, not just somebody who said, "Oh well, I live here. There's a Jewish area, no problems." Why would they want to start in? Okay, so what we have out of that in the European Middle Ages is the blood libel, meaning that Jews killed Christian children for their blood, and that's part of what we see here. Right, this is from the 1470s. Trent, which in Italy shows these horrible sort of woodcuts and drawings of showing the bleeding of Christian child, what's the whole idea? He's as innocent as Jesus, and it always happens just around Passover, Easter, because hey, the Jews have to make a sacrifice again, sacrifice Jesus. So wait a minute, the Jews recall the Exodus from Egypt on Passover. Christians in Easter recall the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay, I'm not going to go into the theology where there's a connection and where it splits, but the point is, if we at the Passover Seder Jews say, we're at this Seder and we're reading the Haggadah, and it's as if we were there, as if we're exiting Egypt. And Christians say, okay, we're in church as if we were there, right? Passover, Pascha we say in Hebrew, but Easter as if we were there, right, with the crucifixion. But what gets thrown into this is that the Jews have to reenact. They have to reenact the death of Jesus, and the best way to do it is an innocent child, because Jesus was that innocent, and draw his blood, and therefore the blood libel, and that the Jews actually they make matzot, right, the matzahs, using innocent child's blood. Other accusation, well poisoning. Well poisoning was Jews were accused of causing everybody to die, and a lot of people figured that's where the Black Plague came from. We know that it was rats and sorts of vermin. Jews died from it as well, as much as many people would like to claim otherwise, that the Jews didn't die. Plenty of Jewish deaths. Okay, we know it for sure. There's the host desecration, right? The wafers that are used for communion in churches. It said that Jews broke into the churches, took them and stabbed them and made them bleed and put them in ovens. Crazy things. And then, of course, so the average person, seeing that about 1/3 of the population dying, is blaming the Jews for this. And what's interesting is that, in particular, was it in the late 1340s, that the Catholic Church is against this because it causes massive violence. They're trying to convince otherwise, but what has happened is now anti-Semitism has become very rooted amongst the people, okay, with these sorts of libel. So it did make its way down in a very direct manner from the top, but the anti-Jewish atmosphere is there, and then when a local priest, cleric, throws in, a certain anti-Jewish perspective, it takes time to catch on, but eventually becomes horrific, right? And therefore, when the Jews are accused of whatever crimes, it's fairly well accepted quite often. Now, obviously, there are those who don't accept it, but the ones who are really violent, those are the ones we read about. Those who are not violent or are not going to stick up for the Jews, we don't hear too much about them. And even if they try to, it often doesn't work. Okay, expulsions. There were theological and economic causes. Very often, Jews were expelled because of issues of, we'll get to it, dealings with money lending, but also if there's enough animosity towards them. If you remember that the aristocracy and clergy who actually need them for certain financial reasons, they can't do anything about it. They don't want to be overthrown. They don't want to fight their own populations. A minor outbreak of violence they'll deal with. But if you're going to sacrifice a minority in order to stay in power, so that's what will, and remember that, sacrificing a minority to stay in power. We'll see that throughout. Okay, and this Black Plague, right, that we can connect to the well poisoning, that Jews would be massacred for it when they themselves are dying. Okay, so the economic issues I alluded to before. Jews, there was this issue, could Jews own land? Now, how many of us have Jews background from Europe? Very few families owned any land. Now, there were here and there, could be, but in general, it wasn't wanted, it wasn't allowed. And the reasons were quite economic and theological. First of all, if a Jew owned land, and we go way back, prior to the Middle Ages, they also owned slaves, because that's how his land was farmed. But remember, if a slave decided to convert to Judaism, he was freed in the 7th year, and Judaism could spread that way. And therefore, you didn't want that to happen. So, you can't own land, you're not going to have that many slaves. Usury, money lending. Right, you got indirect taxation, very high, very high. It could be like up to 25, 33%. And of course, Jews are lending money to the peasantry and others, and the taxation is 90% on it. But people think the Jew is getting all this money. It's indirect taxation by the aristocracy. But the aristocracy is not going to make it direct. They'll get thrown out of power. So you use minority, right, to filter it through, and they're the ones everybody hates. And if the Jews get thrown out, and they do, Okay, we get thrown out. But then you take new Jews, so you don't owe the old Jews any money, right? In other words, they go to the next fiefdom or the next duke or king. They move across the border, right? And you have going from point A to area A to area B, from area B, C, D, right? Everybody moves, and there nobody owes anything. The Jews take with them, some money to lend, but essentially all the debts. They were held where, very often in the parish church, figuring it was safe. And quite often that would be attacked and destroyed. Why? Because they wanted to burn the records. Okay, so forced into this very pleasant sort of function, and of course Jews were also dealt into this tax collection, which made them even less appreciated for sure. Okay, so you have enlightenment. Let's for a moment touch on enlightenment, equality, competition. So what happens? Jews, once there's enlightenment and they can have equal rights, they say, okay, so they have money, and you have the age of capitalism or mercantilism, and the Jewish community, they're used to financing and funding. So if you're used to financing and funding, and you know how to work this, okay, in the feudal world, not going too far. But once you move into the age of mercantilism or capitalism, we find that, and here we go, let everybody see that, we find that the Jew has an advantage because he understands the situation. Also, everybody needs liquid capital. It's, you no longer finance things through agriculture. Okay, so the Jew starts to be seen as a capitalist exploiter. Very often he's the money behind, right, some sort of entrepreneurial adventure, or venture, I should say. There are those Jews who remain poor. They become, quote, socialist revolutionaries. We're familiar with plenty of those, right? So whether we have the Rothschilds as a banking family or someone like Leon Trotsky, whose real name was Lev Davidovich Bronstein, don't get fooled by the name Trotsky. Okay, he's a socialist revolutionary, and others in the Bolshevik Revolution. So you're accused on two levels. Now, you have your local capitalists, right, who are putting together businesses and whatnot. And suddenly the group that had been an out-group or an oppressed group, as they start to gain certain rights through the needs for economic development, they are seen by many as, wait a minute, they were below us. Now they're sort of becoming equal with us. But wait, as capitalism increases and people start to get equal rights in different places, Jews gain equal rights. So then, wait a minute, now this minority even has more money or more opportunities than us? Well, if they weren't farmers and they were constantly being forced, to be literate as well as to work in, call it math or whatever else. So they're working in called skilled profession. Okay, and if you take all of them together, and that would be the overall conspiracy theory that the Jewish conspiracy for world dominance. Look, they're capitalist explorers and they're international financiers, and they own these new countries that are coming out of being kingdoms, or even the kingdom itself that's beginning to become more modern. Therefore, there's a tremendous amount of hatred. Okay, and by the way, it doesn't have to be everybody. There were those who worked with the Jews, but still, there's a groundswell of dislikes. Let's take a look now. Nationalism and race, because we start to get into the racial theories. First, we have to go to Martin Luther. Martin Luther, who tried to get the Jews to convert to Protestantism, was actually very friendly and appealed to the Jews to join him when he first starts his mission. He'd been quite anti the Catholic Church, which was in the 1500s probably the most corrupt institution you can imagine. There was even the Pope had to flee into a castle across from the Vatican. The Vatican was ransacked. Disasters went on. Okay, so he was anti-Catholic Church, and he figured the Jews will join him. But when the Jews didn't, and they basically said, okay, thank you very much, we're glad you're not against us, but we're not giving up who and what we are, he turned on them and became really violently, violent, vicious. He called them disgusting vermin. He called the Jews vicious, right? And on that, right, he sort of hints at, although there aren't racial theories at the time, that the Jews that their essence, their being, is evil. Okay, and from there we do go to racial theories and blood defilement, we have down here, right, with Hitler and the final solution, and of course the caricatures of a Jew with an Aryan woman, right, this whole blood defilement. And Hitler, of course, will aim for what's called the final solution, his war on the Jews. Okay, and it actually is that. In other words, his first war is against the Jews. That's how he sees it, because it's a racial war. And he will see, of course, that his perspective is the Jews stand behind the West, whether it be Churchill or Roosevelt. And of course, the Jews are communist. Stalin. Now, let's remember something. Stalin persecuted the Jews. We know it from the purges and in the 30s and beyond. And Roosevelt was no great lover of Jews. They thought he was until his archives were opened in the 1970s. And anti-Semitism, of course, lives well beyond, right, post-World War II. It's buried a bit in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s because it's not acceptable. Unfortunately, today, much of anti-Semitism has returned. So we have World War II and the Holocaust. The war of racial exterminations. How do we get to this? People would tell me, you often say, well, this racial theory, it's, is it Christian? Where did it come from? So it comes, in essence, from Enlightenment. Because if everything is a matter of science, so then it's a matter of enlightenment. We're going to prove it, but it becomes pseudoscience. People believe certain things. They say that scientists develop this theory. The moral ethical issue is thrown out. And by the way, those who persecuted Jews, right, wasn't there even if they call themselves, let's say, religious. But the issue of questioning, in other words, someone who's coming out of enlightenment, you certainly have the positive side saying they're like us. We should give equal rights. They're human beings. There's always all sorts of conditional things. Could they remain Jewish as a matter of course? Should they do it more like us? Where are their loyalties? We'll put that aside, okay? But going to kill all the Jews because of their race. And this is a scientific understanding. In other words, wait a minute. So out of enlightenment also comes this, and the answer is, unfortunately, yes. People got convinced that science was the answer to everything, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, does this make any sense? Because it was obviously pseudo-science. There are plenty of Jews who had blonde hair and blue eyes and light-colored skin. And of course, the whole theory that was built up by the Nazis, all right? And by the way, you had Arthur de Gobineau, half German, half French. You had Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was half British and half German, he died before Hitler made began to be known politically, but his wife was an honored guest that rallies by Hitler's party. And these racial theories spread throughout Europe, by the way, also to North America. We're familiar with the Naturalization Immigration Acts of 1921 and 24. They very much, the Americans wanted to and did limit immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. It wasn't only against the Jews, who were Eastern Europe, but against the Slavs of Eastern Europe, against the Greeks and Italians and Spanish, Portuguese of Southern Europe. They wanted Northern and Northwestern Europeans. Right? It was also, for sure, against the Far East, what was known as the Yellow Peril, Chinese coming to America. So when we look at this culmination of anti-Semitism, starts with the ancient world, cultural. It goes through a theological phase, of course, in the Christian scriptures, and not from exactly the time of Jesus, but those who write afterwards. Okay, becomes part of the framework of the churches. Also into Protestantism, Lutheranism, Islam adopting many of these understandings, and the law code from the Byzantines, because once you have a law code, right, so then it's just a matter of course everything you do. That's just the way it has to be. and Jews living in separate quarters and paying special taxes and being expelled and having only certain jobs they can do, on and on. Add to that, we get towards the modern period, and capitalism and the Jewish function that had been seen as not particularly desirable, it became much more of an actor in building modern capitalist society, and Jews are seen as the ones who making the money and exploiting everybody. And then, of course, the rebellion, socialism, we discussed before, wherever the Jews are. Okay, and it culminates in the Holocaust. Because you could ask, why kill the Jews, or why do this, that, or the other? There isn't one answer. It's just they are bad. What's known as demonization. Demonization. They're the devil. Leave it at that. You don't need to go any further. Okay, so post-World War II, you had those who were against Zionism. It becomes the cover for the new anti-Semitism. It's not immediate. People are not in favor, we'll say the diplomats, international relations, they're not in favor of having a Jewish state. Judaism, many people would say, is only a religion and not a people. That's what would start coming out of this. But let's stick with the idea of building a Jewish state. We have here the partition plan from November of 47, which eventually passed in the UN. There would be no enforcement. A Jewish and Arab state in Palestine. It was left from the Palestine Mandate, where the British had been. The state of Israel will be established despite the Holocaust, not because of it. Truman, the Americans, would be convinced, not only lobbying, but just the tenacity of the Zionist movement. So, what happens? Where is that whole anti-Zionism coming from? Okay, so the state's established. We're not going into the 48 war or anything like that. But by the time you get to the 60s, all right, you have the New Left at the mid-60s and the end of the 60s and onwards. So this whole accusation of the Old Testament, and meaning Tanakh, it's all a myth. Whatever archaeological remains you find, they're dismissed, right? Because that's the national sport in Israel. Sure, we were here. The original sin is in having established the state, right? Well, we were invaded, and then there are Palestinian Arab refugees. People forget there were lots of Jewish refugees at the very beginning of the battles, with the counterattack. And that we should be forbidden to ingather exiles. Why should we be forbidden? This is the land of Israel. Okay, and these people, right, we're talking not someone who wants a two-state solution, but those who are against the Jews having any sort of state of their own. So they condemn a two-state solution. And if you take all the peoples in the world, only the Jews have no right to a state. Now, we talk about the Jews and we go back in history, here, end up in exile, right? Different reasons for it. Many think in theological terms, we can think in just rational terms of conflict. But the Jews did not give up on that this is the ancient homeland. And that was done through not only religious practice, but there were Jewish nationalists, if you want, people saying we need to come back. It's true that it was not a majority movement at the outset because people didn't think it was possible. But the more it looked possible, the more people joined. Okay, so what's the other problem here? Okay, Jewish communities survive and thrive worldwide. Despite all, you have the success of the Zionist idea after 75, 76 years. And its realization, the state of Israel, despite wars, immigration, boycotts, condemnations, everything up here. And in the diaspora, for the most part, the Jews are successful. It's true, there are places they were very oppressed, take the Soviet Union, and there's that whole Stalinist anti-Semitism there, Bolshevik. And eventually, when Jews do have the opportunity, most leave. Okay? What had been the great promise there fails. Now, how could this be? So many people just chalk it up. It's conspiracy. Can't be. Supernatural powers. You'll find something that sort of like the devil's on the Jewish side. Once again, demonization. And here I have at the bottom here, we have the far right. David Duke, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party, the British. We know it was there just a few years ago. Lots of anti-Semitism. It's been cleared out, at least officially. And of course, when you get to what happens dealing with Hamas and Islamic anti-Semitism, Rabbi Yechia Sinwar. Okay, so but it all comes together, right? You have your right, left, and jihad, Islamic. So, for a moment, going into the Hamas covenant, because that's what lots of us are dealing with nowadays, and it says right there in Article 22, and I did lots of research on this, wrote a book called Hamas Jihad, published it more than 8 years ago. It is crystal clear. The Jews controlled what they say is the world media, all the banks and monies, that we destroyed the caliphate. By the way, that's taken from the protocols of the elders of Zion, saying we're destroying the leaders of Christendom, that the Jews instigated World War I and World War II and all the revolutions in the world, and that we actually command the empires, East, West. We control the United Nations, at one time the League of Nations, now it's the United Nations, and that Jews support evil worldwide. Islam is here to destroy the Jews. Okay, and it says from the outset, if you go to the preamble of the Hamas covenant, which, by the way, is a covenant, it's a holy document inspired by Allah, by God, it says Islam, right? Who's the great enemy? The Jews. It doesn't say the Zionists, it says the Jews. And there's one place where it says, oh, Abdallah, right? There's a Jew hiding behind rocks and trees, whatever. Kill him. And another place where we're to be subject to the Dima, or the subject community, right? That we're not equal. People would say second class. It's well much less than that. Okay. So we have that unholy alliance. We're going to throw in a fourth part. Right? And today, that unholy alliance, we have intellectuals, universities, and it's in the guise of this Palestinian nationalism. You see people with these Palestinian flags and demonstrating. Many students who don't, they're chanting from the river to the sea. They don't know which river. They don't know which sea. They want to be like cool. By the way, you had this type of thing with the Nazi Party and in German campuses. Right? People, many of the students, they just joined. They were in book burning and whatnot. And it's the Jews everything. Okay. Here, there's a veneer. Give it that much. There's a veneer. The Palestinian nationalism. We know that what happened on October 7th. There's an explosion of hatred against the Jews. But wait a minute. It starts already a couple days after the great massacre that takes place on October 7th. Right? You have not only a massacre, but rape, pillage, plunder, total destruction. And blaming Israel, blaming the Jews. And the attacks, they say, oh, it's just against Israel, but we know what happened to Jewish students on campus, how they were abused, how there were anti-Semitic chants. So Palestinian nationalism is a guise. He's saying people who want Palestinian independence or whatever, they're not talking about any sort of discussion, right? Go back to the partition plan with the United Nations. Go back to the fact that Israel has peace agreements with two of its neighbors. Go back to Oslo, where Israel is in the middle of discussions of peace accords. Okay, and one could say, Israel's government at the moment is not exactly what we call left wing or whatever, but still, these accords are there, and it is a matter that one can start a process again, and that's not what is being said. Said that attack, destroy Israel, the Jews. Now, generally, we heard such things would come out of the right, racial supremacists. We're familiar with, right? The Klan, those types, and neo-Nazi types. The left, communist, anarchist, progressives, they're the ones now who are said to be leading this movement. But in leading this movement, they're actually calling for, and we know it, if you want to eliminate Israel, calling for a genocide of the Jews in Israel. Right? Their elimination. That's what stands behind this. I don't know how many of them are just fools or just following on because it's the cool thing to do. And we know that there's a lot of pressure like that at universities, but it's gone into demonstrations that are not just in universities. Plus, in the name of freedom of speech, the university presidents and officials and will say the faculty, they're not standing against it. Some are with it. And we heard that ridiculous discussion in Congress, and the 3 presidents of universities, Ivy League, and then there was a 4th that showed up from Columbia who just resigned, right? This idea of what is the context? What's the context? Okay, so really believe the context is freedom of speech. It's not incitement. And here it comes from the intellectuals, from the universities. The intellectuals that are not stopping it, and those who are starting it. We know, okay, there's been a lot of Qatari money involved, a lot of Wahhabist understandings, but there also are, in the guise of, right, sort of Palestinian nationalism or just anti-Israel. That's what becomes so dangerous, because the average student, and certainly faculty that are in favor of this and may know better, and maybe they don't dig down any deeper, because what starts with the Jews ends with everybody else. We saw what happened in Nazi Germany. We see what happens where the Jews are persecuted severely. So we speak of these Islamic jihadis who are now in cahoots with the left, communist, anarchist, progressive, call them whatever you want, and supported by the right racial supremacists who aren't, the Klan isn't going to march on campus or with Nazi flags, but truth is, they're all together. Now, you also have self-hating Jews. There I have Noam Chomsky down here. Okay? He visited Nasrallah, Hezbollah. He was in Lebanon. Must be a good 10 years ago, maybe a bit more. And wants very much the end of Israel. The Iranians support this. And unfortunately, in every generation, we've had those who were very against us, Jews from the inside, who claimed that, no, that's not what they want, that's not what they mean. And nowadays, it's just it's a facade of anti-Zionism. Because one could say, we don't agree with Israel's policies. Israel is a state like other states. There needs to be a 2-state solution. These need to be the conditions, on. You could agree, you could disagree, but it's not calling for the end of Israel. So let's talk about the international community. Okay, the United Nations. Well, it was a global organization response to the massacre of Israeli civilians, right? What I've got up there on top. UN's women's organizations, completely silent. Rape, massacre, mutilations, and I won't go into those mutilations. You've heard about them. There have been plenty of movies out there. Nothing. Took well over 200 days before they sent someone here to even begin to investigate. What about the children who were kidnapped? Babies, toddlers, and they didn't survive a lot. They're still not back. Silent. UNICEF. We had over 200,000 civilian refugees. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. They don't do anything. Today we still have tens of thousands of refugees, north and south. No offers to help. In other words, if it's Jewish, it doesn't count. This is anti-Semitism. All right? People would say, well, they didn't say anything anti-Semitic. It reminds us, right, during World War II, of all the bystanders who watched as Jews would be massacred. We have the anti-Semitism, vile, right? That's not being condemned. International communities, right? The attacks against Jews, Israel, and by the way, there were a lot of non-Jews there also who were killed. What happens on October 7th? Sort of like, it didn't happen. It wasn't there. It's not important, right? Let's take Amnesty International. They're always screaming about something. Did they scream this time? Yeah, treatment of Nukhba terrorist captives. It's true. We captured them. It's true. They're interrogated. Lots of them gave information without much of an interrogation because it makes them feel important. And yes, apparently there were some abuses, but we put soldiers on trial for that. Did you ever hear of Hamas putting anybody on trial for suspected abuse of hostages, or Gilad Shalit when he was in captivity there? Okay, that's all they care about. And the Red Cross, yeah, they were supposed to visit the hostages. They never got there. They're not going to visit the hostages. There's still plenty there. Yes, they helped arrange the exchange deal with prisoners. Let's make it very clear. Prisoners as opposed to hostages. All right, we're talking about the civilians. Remember, soldiers weren't let go. Right, the whole discussion about some of the female soldiers now. Right? So what do we have is, at best, the international organizations are observers. And of course, their criticism, condemnations against Israel. I'm not even going to go into the International Criminal Court or the ICJ, right? And accusations against us, comparing us to Hamas when being asked to put out arrest warrants for the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister, which hasn't been done yet. Okay? So this sort of insanity of anti-Semitism, we never expected that we'd be at this stage again in history. You would take before October 7th, 23. Yes, we know there's anti-Semitism out there, and it has been since the end of World War II, up and down, but never at these levels. Right? There's been a really deep dig of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, as previously we spoke about, in academia, and it's penetrated. And the world community, their organizations, as we have here, are infected with it. Okay. Look, we're going to stop here and hope that people got a good amount of information from the talk. And we very much look forward to seeing you in our courses, where we'll be investigating many things about the Middle East, Israel, the Jewish world, and have a good one.